Hey, it's good to see so many of you this morning. Um, let's start with a poem. I woke up this morning and this was the poem that was on my mind. It is 3:23 in the morning and I am awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, "What did you do when the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth unraveled? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing. As mammals, reptiles, and birds were dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew?" It's a poem by Drew Dillinger. And I rolled out of bed this morning and that popped into my head. It's a troubling poem, really. It's actually one that I don't like to give much thought to. And I've been wondering this week what I might share today because we committed as a group, as a community, to spend a full year talking about Terra, Earth. What is our relationship with Earth, with the Earth's ethos? And what if each week, through my own talks and all of the really amazing people that have come through our doors in the last year, not to mention the meditations, which in my opinion are way better than the talks. What if we just continued to come back around to the question, what is our relationship with the earth like? What is the earth's ethos? And so this week I want to kind of wind it down because we're all done. We don't need to think about it anymore. And I started asking myself, what have I learned? And in some ways, that's what I want to do today. I want to talk about a couple things that I feel like I learned personally. And then I want to talk a little bit about what Thomas Berry calls our way into the future. There are several writers that have been informing me. Bill Plotkin is one of them. That was part of, we talked about the human psyche and its relatedness to nature. So Bill Plotkin was one. The other was Thomas Berry, along with a few others. But Thomas Berry, this is a book recommendation. He has a book called The Great Work, Our Way into the Future. He's one of the more radical, I don't know what to call him exactly. He's sort of like maybe an eco-philosopher, mystic kind of person. And I want to take just two of his ideas at the end. So I want to talk about personally and then some Thomas Berry ideas moving forward. But I want this poem to do its work in terms of troubling us, our great-great-grandchildren. What did you do? In other words, what are you doing? And that's how I feel too. And I have to be honest that I wake up sometimes and I don't have a lot of hope. And I read too much. And I read everything from sort of post-apocalyptic dystopian information, like Russell brought up this morning in our pre-talk. Hey, in a billion years, the sun will have expanded and made the earth uninhabitable anyway. He didn't put it like that. But and all kinds of other predictions about the future, which are a lot more immediate than a billion years. I read that kind of stuff, and I read stuff that, hey, it's not going to be that bad. But you know what they all have in common? That we are now beginning to reap what we sow. That our human involvement on the planet, we're beginning to reap what we sow. A good example is Belmont, Michigan, where I grew up and drank the poisoned water from our wells. And that was only 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when we put toxic chemicals into the ground. That's basic karma. And extend that out on a larger scale, and there's a general agreement on the right and the left that we are in a phase where we are reaping what we've sowed. Correct? So it's okay, I guess, from time to time to be troubled. And that's what I'm in that space today. I feel troubled. Sometimes I feel filled with hope, and sometimes I don't. Today is one of those troubling days. So here's the first thing that I feel like I've learned. Number one, I'm a hypocrite. That is the bottom line. Do you know that I have voted for the Green Party ever since I could vote? You know why? Because I'm not a Republican and I'm not really a Democrat and I don't know what an independent is. And I sort of took that vote as a vote of protest. Do you know what difference it made? Yeah, zero, probably. So I have an ideology, and I have since I was a young person, that I don't want to do harm to the earth. But do you know how I live? There is a massive gap between my ideology, my ideas, and how I live. Have you been paying attention to the plastics business in the ocean waterways and microplastics in the Great Lakes and so forth? And I thought, hey, I should do something about this. I should eliminate single-use plastics. And maybe I should just eliminate plastic from my life, except I can't. It's in my furniture. It's in my carpet. It's in the razor I use. It's in my toothbrush. It's in my car. It's in the part of the binding chemicals in the roadway that brought me from Grand Rapids to Grand Haven. It's everywhere. It's in my phone. It's in my watch. It's in the binding of my fancy books that I buy right here and on the front. Oh, I don't use plastics because I'm green. Do you see what I mean? I'm a hypocrite. So, and I think that's part of the consumer culture we live in. And so, what might I say about that? I feel like after a year of, at least in my own small way, trying to turn my attention to some of these big questions, I feel like I'm back to wanting to live forth, I guess, a very Buddhist principle. Well, how can I cause less suffering in the world? And that's what I feel like I want to say out loud. What am I learning from, what do I want to do next year? I want to cause less suffering. That's what I want to do. And do I know how much difference it's going to make? I don't. I don't know how much difference it's going to make. But if I allow myself just for a moment to hear the dream of my own great-great-grandchildren saying, did you do anything? I want to at least attempt to say, I tried to cause less suffering in the world. And I tried to alleviate suffering. Maybe that's two sides of the same coin. I want to cause less suffering, and I want to try to alleviate suffering. And how much difference is it going to make? I don't know. But I think what I'd like to say about that is that I'd like to try to be a generative presence in the world, and I'd love for you all to join me because it's the right thing to do. Even it's the moral thing to do, not knowing how the math will work out. The funny thing about science and what should we say, climate science in general and predictions in general is that We know what we're doing, increasingly so. We know what we're doing. We don't know how the environment will react to what we're doing. That's the unknown. There's always unknown factors. And that can lead to all kinds of excuses, like, well, we don't really know, so let's just hope for the best. But what I'm suggesting is that it's the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do. To say, can we cause less suffering for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and for all beings? At least that's kind of the hope. So I feel particularly challenged by my own hypocrisies. And I don't want to fool myself that just because I have the right political views doesn't mean I'm living really any differently than anybody else. It sure feels like I am, but when I make a post on my Facebook page, which is run by plastics, you know what I'm saying. So that's number one. Number two, here's the other thing I think I've learned. Part of turning our attention to the cycles of things, like the seasons, and the cycles of the earth and so forth, I've discovered, I guess what I might say, that the earth has a tremendous capacity, or nature, with a capital N, has a tremendous capacity to do two things almost at the same time, which is conserve and innovate. It self-protects and it innovates, which tells me something. That human beings, in their essence, in their nature, because they are nature, can do two things: conserve and innovate. That's actually the very foundation of evolution itself. Conservation and innovation in a kind of dance. Now, what does that tell me about the human experiment, cultural experiment? It tells me something like we're going to have people who are drawn toward conserving, and some are drawn toward innovation. I actually gave a talk on this in the middle of the year, and it surprised me that the science is saying we have something like a proclivity toward a red brain or a blue brain. That's from Shankara Vedankara. Shankara. You know Shankara, my friend. The Hidden Brain is his podcast on NPR. Anyway, he's saying the science seems to bear out that people tend to have a disposition. What am I saying? That there's a disposition in the brain to be red or blue, or conservative or liberal. And they both serve a purpose. I wish I did not learn that. Because honestly, I swear, my fundamental assumption was that the way enlightenment works is you start off conservative and you end up liberal. Now you want to believe that too, don't you? Because then you can feel self-righteous and look at all the progress I've made. I'd like to say it's false. Now, it doesn't mean that sometimes we don't change our mind about big things. But if nature says there's a place to conserve and there's a place to innovate, then that's probably just the way it is. So, we live in a very contentious landscape right now, politically. If you're not aware of this, you've been, I don't know what your problem is. And one of the things that fuels it is that our brains love a good fight, or flight, or freeze. And whenever we, and I should say I, fall under the assumption that the problem is the other, I'm just perpetuating the same system. I disagree with everything Trump says, although I don't know because he's said something like 12,000 false things, which makes disagreeing kind of weird. I don't agree. Wait a minute. That's not true. Wait a minute. But if I just participate in a conversation of divisiveness, that I have the truth and the other people have nothing to offer, I perpetuate the same fight, flight, or freeze, instinctual lizard brain reactivity that is fueling our political divisions. So, my question to myself, honestly, is what needs to be conserved? What role does conservation have? I think that's so funny about being a conservative. It's in the word. Conservatives ought to be the champions of conservation. And they were at one time. You laugh, but they were. And many of them still are. And what about the liberals? Do we need some innovation? Are we stuck? You know, like I'm always saying from Einstein, no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it. We need innovation. We need shifts in consciousness. So do liberal people have a role? See, that kind of tension is the way nature works. So I'm saying this is what I'm learning. What needs to be conserved? I have things like land, values, certain values, traditions, freedoms, water, air, soil, rights. Be nice to conserve, be nice to extend the rights to more and more people, and then maybe to more and more beings and places. That's conserving work, believe it or not. And what needs innovation? Well, institutions, systems, a two-party political system, and that is about as boring as you can get, you know? Ways of life, ways of living, technologies. You make a list. So that's what I feel like, in part, I'm learning. To calm down a little bit and to be a little less self-righteous about my own ideologies and my own ideas. And ask, all right, if this is the way nature is, how can we enter that with more conscious awareness, less reactivity? Are you hearing what I'm saying? I'm not asking you to agree. I'm just telling you what I'm learning. Number 3. When I was a student in Israel, one of my friends who is an Anglican priest, he was giving a talk one day, and he said, Western society, Western culture is moving spiritually backwards. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what he means by that. But that still haunts me. Western society is moving spiritually backwards. And I thought about that this week because I think in part what we need, in part, in my opinion, is a kind of spiritual revolution. And what I mean by that is a spiritual relationship with the earth itself and with other human beings on the earth in what I would call a kind of sacred reciprocity. How did I learn that? That's the way of nature. Nature is in a kind of sacred reciprocity with itself in the life, death, life cycle of all things. It gives, it takes, it gives, it takes. That's sacred reciprocity. That's a dance. Somehow, because of our technological advancement and even the advancements in our brain, which if you want to blame something, you can blame evolution for that, we have learned ways to cut that kind of sacred reciprocity off. That's called the extraction economy that we live in. We take, and we take, and we take, and we take. There's not a sacred reciprocity. There's not a dance. And to me, in my mind, that's a kind of spiritual way of life. That's what I would suggest. It's a spiritual way of being in the world. How do I live in sacred reciprocity with the earth community? That's a challenging question. It doesn't matter to me what kind of religion you're a part of. Just because you're a part of a religion or you're not part of a religion doesn't mean you're living in sacred reciprocity with anything. Am I making sense? So I feel that as a kind of challenge on my own life. And I think we need more rituals, ceremonies, music, art, dance, stories, narratives, television shows, movies that point the way toward sacred reciprocity as a way of life. After all, we're in sacred reciprocity with our great-great-grandchildren. What we're doing now is in tension and harmony, or in conversation with the future. We know that. Don't you know that? How you're living your life right now affects your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And to bring more consciousness to that is to live in a kind of sacred reciprocity. It also means we have to try to find a way out of extraction only as a way of life. Extraction, use, and waste. That's our relationship with most things. And I'm not blaming anybody but myself as a willing participant in the way things are. So those are three things I feel like I'm being challenged by. And I'd like to live less like a hypocrite in the coming year. Hypocrite is a Greek word for actor. And or we can use the Latin word persona, mask. It's so much easier to act, be an actor, than it is to make the kind of changes that I'm talking about. Am I right? So to Thomas Berry, a couple things I want. I find that he seems to be challenging us as a way forward, and I think the first one is that he says something like this: we need a better relationship with time itself. We need a longer view of time itself. That we are part of an emergent and unfolding story that is mind-blowing in its scale. In terms of the sheer size of the universe, in terms of the sheer vastness of time itself, of which the human experiment is only one tiny sliver. These are the humbling facts that we're just starting to bump up against for the first time. Is that thunder? See, even the gods agree with what I'm saying. And that experience of smallness that you even feel in the thunderstorm, he's saying it's time we expand that out even further. The vastness of time itself. But, he says, we're facing a unique challenge based on the scientific revolution. And for the first time, we're coming to understand just how complex evolution is, period. And evolution, I think, in some ways, is the biggest existential threat to human anthropocentric tendencies. That was a really fancy way of saying we've tended to think we're at the center of the universe until we discovered evolution. And then we're like, oh crap. How do we get here? What the heck is going on? And we're not going to be here all that long. That's a kind of wake-up call. That's a kind of thunderous voice saying, wait a minute, and shakes us up a bit. So he has some suggestions, and I want to give you one this morning as a kind of question mark. So he says there's two basic approaches to how human beings are beginning to wrestle with evolution in the vast sense of time. The first is the blind watchmaker. That's Dawkins and other sort of new atheists. That, yes, there's something like a watch. That's, by the way, if you don't know what the watchmaker was, that was the way theists tended to argue for the existence of God. See, everything works in order, there must be a watchmaker. And Dawkins came along and said, sure, there's a watchmaker, he's just blind. And we got here because of random, because of everything we're talking about being random. And why is it the case? Nobody knows, and who cares? It's the wrong question. The blind watchmaker. The problem with that is not that it might be true, because if it's true, what can we do about it? The problem is actually might have something to do with what then motivates us. Because if everything is random, everything is random. Correct? And I keep bringing up what Ken Wilber says, that our culture is caught in a cul-de-sac of nihilism or narcissism, in part because of a reaction to this idea. If things are random, even if you don't want to look at that, I might as well get all I can, narcissism, it's about me, or there is no meaning. That's nihilism. And around the cul-de-sac we go. So the blind watchmaker is an approach. Now you can say, well, it's a little more nuanced than that, but you can talk to me later during talkback if you want, okay? The other, he says, is an approach to evolution with Desjardins, and started with him, but a few others, that says it's neither random nor determined, because that's the other approach. It's totally random or God made it all, okay? So it's neither random nor determined, but something that is called sort of a creative emergence. And the fact seems to be that we move from simple to complex. How do we know that? Because we moved from simple to complex. We know that. That's a fact. It's a scientific fact. And something like a creative force is at work that's neither random nor deterministic. It's in a kind of dance. Now, how do you prove either one of these? You don't. But they're part of the conversation. And what he's saying is that if we begin to choose something like a creative emergent universe, then we become participants in the future. Rather than it doesn't matter what we do. Do you see the difference? So I think when I think about a way into the future, what I'd like to argue for, not that I'm a scientist, but that we live in a creative universe, what he calls the dream of the earth. And the earth, in a sense, dreamed us up. And we are here because of a kind of creative process that we can participate in. Which, again, puts human beings not in the driver's seat. Nobody's in the driver's seat when you realize the sun is expanding and in 1 billion years, none of us will be here. So it doesn't put us in the driver's seat, but it puts us in a kind of creative relationship or sacred reciprocity, that's my word, with Earth itself. So, and if I want to be more simple, do you want to be a creative force for emergent consciousness or not? My hope is that you say something like, yeah, I'd like to be a creative, generative. I don't exactly know how I got here, but I'd like to be a creative, generative presence on the earth. And that's what Thomas Berry seems to be inviting us into as a way forward. So that's number one. Number two, he says something interesting. Is it raining now? I love this. The gods agree. He says we need, I'm going to do this quickly because I want to try to build a bridge to what I'd like to talk about in the fall. But interestingly enough, in this same book, The Great Work, he says we need 4 wisdoms in order to do this. And I'll just give them to you and I won't go into great detail. He says we need the wisdom of indigenous people. And he says why? He says because the indigenous people never lost the relationship with the cycles of the earth community. They never lost that. So we need that wisdom if we're going to live in a creative, emergent universe going forward. We have to learn to submit to the cycles of nature itself rather than an extraction-based economy. So we need the wisdom of indigenous people, who, by the way, have a much more conserving voice to offer us. Have you noticed the oil protests in North Dakota, for example, largely led by women, say that that we are protectors of the water? Do you see how fundamentally different that is? Protecting something is very different than it's mine to use for what I decide it to be, that it somehow has innate rights. And I'm part of my role is to protect. Well, that's the wisdom of indigenous people. That can be extended out. There's a tribe that lives in the Grand Canyon. They had to argue with the government when the Grand Canyon was made a national park. And they said, you can live in here. And they said, the reason why we want to live in the Grand Canyon is because we've been protecting the canyon for 1,000 years. That's a very interesting relationship with the earth, correct? So he says we need the wisdom of indigenous people. Number two, we need the wisdom of women, who have largely been left out of the conversation about how the extraction economy is supposed to work. He says we need the wisdom of women. I'm not. See, they're applauding. Even the gods agree, you know? So we need the wisdom of indigenous people. We need the wisdom of women. And he says we need the wisdom of the classical tradition. And that's something I want to talk about this fall. We live in an age where the ticker on the bottom of the screen, whatever is most urgent, is considered to be important. That is not in conversation with the great wisdom traditions. And I mean the philosophical traditions, I mean the scientific traditions, and I mean the great spiritual or religious traditions around the world. We must find ways to converse with the classical tradition, says Thomas Berry. I happen to agree. In fact, this is what I want to do this fall. I want to return to our values. And I want to do at least a month on each of our values. Because it's very important from time to time for us to look again at what the heck are we doing here? What is bringing us together? What are we here to promote? This is now a sacred language. That's the new sacred story, meaning human evolution and evolution more broadly. It's the new sacred story, and we need to treat it as such. Um, Okay. Trying to figure out if that's all I wanted to say. The gods agree.